Good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to begin our webinar in just a few seconds. While you wait, please enter into the chat what organization you're from and what your name is. Again, for anyone just popping on, please enter your organization and what your name is in the chat. Thank you, Carissa, for kicking us off. All right, it looks like we have a good amount of people in, so let's get started. Good afternoon and welcome to the Indiana Youth Institute's webinar on board recruitment and engagement in today's nonprofit. My name is Whitney Johnson and I am supporting the Strengthening Youth Programs Initiative, SYPI, at IYI. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation. We are grateful to have the chance to connect as a community of Indiana youth workers who remain committed to meeting the needs of our youth and our children. For those of you who are not familiar with IYI, our mission is to improve the lives of all Indiana children by strengthening and connecting the people, organizations, and communities that are focused on kids and youth. Listed here, you can see our vision that drives the work we do for Indiana youth. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few pointers that will help you engage with today's webinar. For any technical support issues, use the chat feature to send a message to Erin Whitcomb, IYI's registration manager, behind the scenes to assist you, and use this feature to converse with the group as well. As an added bonus, you can download a copy of today's PowerPoint from the chat. We also encourage you to ask questions, so please use the Q&A feature for any that you may have, and we will get in as many as possible. Feel free to also upvote. Great. Today, you will receive an email with a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know your thoughts about today's presentation. And if you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk email as it may have been directed there. Will be redirected to your. Today's webinar will be posted on our website if you'd like to revisit a portion or later want to share the opportunity to listen in with partners. Our speaker today is Dave Sternberg. Dave is a graduate of The Ohio State University and is a founding partner of Loring Sternberg and Associates with over 25 years of nonprofit experience. He authored Fearless Fundraising for Nonprofit Boards, second edition, and bestseller among board source publications. Since 2000, Dave has been a member of the faculty at the Lilly School of Philanthropy at Indiana University's Fundraising School and is also the original author of the course Purposeful Boards, Powerful Fundraising. For the Fundraising School, he has taught building the annual fund, marketing for fundraising, managing the capital campaign, principles and techniques, major gifts, as well as numerous customized training programs nationally and internationally. Now that you know you're in good hands, it is now my pleasure to turn it over to our speaker for today, Dave Sternberg.
Thank you, Whitney. I appreciate that introduction. It was so well done. I may just take you with me everywhere I go. It was a nice job. And so let me the other thing, Whitney, most people don't know about me is that I was president of my 7th grade class both years, and I think that is meaningful because it shows that in this environment I have some staying power. So I wanted to share that. But I encourage you all as we go through to send your questions in, and don't hesitate to, if you need to, just come off mute and interrupt me. I'm cool with that. I'm pretty easygoing. And before we begin, I just want to, so get your fingers on your keyboard and get ready. I just want to take a quick pulse of who's with us today that is a board member and who is staff. So just your role, you don't have to say your organization, just type in board or staff real quick. I just want to get a flavor of who we have. Lots of staff members. You see if there's any board members, okay? The board members that are here today, first of all, thank you. And that's because your organization recognizes you as someone who says, there's things to learn here. And I appreciate that. I always call those board members get it's. So I just wanted to make sure that we had a mix of folks here because what I'm going to share, while it's very board driven and very board directed, is valuable on both sides of that equation. So it's certainly always easier to bring a message back when a board member has heard it and is part of that message. So what we're going to talk about today, essentially, and because we have an hour, we could spend all day on this subject, is I'm going to share with you a system, a cycle, as you see here, on how to build your boards. And the term board, and you can see this is from a book called The Board Building Cycle, which you can get from Board Source. And the author is just a tremendously brilliant person. That's a colleague of mine. But um, I like the book. It's a workbook. It's not a dense piece of reading material. And so I'm going to walk you through what the book will share. And I certainly encourage you to use both resources. But the value in it being called a cycle is that it is indeed a cycle. And as has been noted, it is essentially three components that work together to create the entire system. And the word building is super important because oftentimes we've identified and recruited board members and they're on the board. And that can be very short-sighted. And you'll see why I say that as we go through our time together. But this is about not just bringing people to the board, but how to grow them, how to create accountability, how to bring in new folks, right? And how to recognize all the work that we're doing and keep that system in place. One thing I've learned after decades, and that's not an exaggeration of governance work, is the boards that do this consistently are stronger, better, faster than other boards and other organizations. So keep that in mind as we go through this together and identify for yourself what are the areas within your board that you might already be doing and those things that you can improve on, or even those things that you might think about adding as we go. So let's start with step one of the board building cycle. One is identifying the kinds of people that we need on our board. What kind of knowledge, experience, professions, what are the things that are going to help us move our organization forward? And so they share in this frame, we share a matrix. And the way the matrix works is to create for your organization all of the categories and descriptors of things that would be of value to your board in helping your organization move forward. Now, the book in this here has a great starting point and a great example. You are free to make use of this in a way that best fits you. So you create one for you. But essentially, what you do with a matrix is you then mark or keep track of all of your existing board members by indicating where they fall on this matrix. So check, notate what are the qualities that you presently have on your board. And if you do a matrix style, and why I like this is you will note in a matrix, you will see gaps. You will see things that you don't have. You might notice we have too much of something. Okay, so you notice what you have, and you're going to notice where the gaps are. Now, note, it isn't to fill all the gaps. The goal is not to complete this chart in its entirety. The point of the matrix is to identify areas where there are gaps and determine if those gaps are important to your organization. Now, using those gaps, that then becomes your guide on who you're looking for in an ideal scenario to potentially bring to our board. Potentially, how do we create a list of individuals who meet a criteria that's important for our organization? Because historically in the sector where we hamper ourselves is we decide to go out and bring people on the board and hope they're good. We didn't do enough sort of strategic visioning about what we're looking for, or as you will see in a minute, potentially spending the right kind of time with potential candidates. So all this does is help you identify the gaps and help you think about what's important. What I strongly suggest when you understand what your gaps are and which things you're recruiting for, you share that list with the board and you share it with them on a pretty routine basis. Is that every meeting? Is that every other meeting? Because what you'd like to get from them when you show them a list of names or show them a list of criteria is names. You simply want to ask them, who do you know that fits some or all of this criteria? And anecdotally, what I hear in response is um, we now have a much different makeup of the kinds of people we're moving forward with. Now, that doesn't mean anyone whose name you get will become a board member, or you may not invite them. There could be other roles for them, but now you're being very strategic about it. And encourage your board members to think about places where they can actually find board members. I hear this a lot. Well, okay, yeah, I can see what difference it makes when we know who we're looking for, but where do I look? And we know a lot of these things. So those associations, places of worship, professional association, right? Donors, other high performing boards. Where are those individuals based on the criteria and what you're looking for? So think about the places that you can find board members and think about your matrix. Okay. Again, what do you have in abundance? What are you missing? What are you missing? What professions, what industries, what areas of influence, what community members? Always be thinking about, does that matrix reflect what it needs to reflect in order for us to find the right gaps? The next step in the board building cycle is cultivate. So imagine you've gone through step one and you now have a list of potential board members. Well, at this point, your role then is to cultivate those individuals. And when I say your role, I'm really specifically talking about the board. It is the board's job to cultivate the people it wishes to potentially bring to the board. So over time, and I underscore over time, and thorough and thoughtful, things like attending a board meeting, attending the event, maybe it's serving on a committee, it is meeting other board members, it is looking at the finances, it is meeting staff, it is looking at our programs in action. It is helping us in many other ways. If that were your list of cultivation items, it takes a little time. Is it weeks? Is it months? I don't know for every organization. What I do know is one day is not enough time. 1 week is not enough time. Maybe several weeks is not enough time. We are not trying to fill a vacant seat with a person. We are trying to fill a vacant seat with the right person. Okay. So be thoughtful and be strategic. And I've said this to clients for years. You may have added 3 people, but are they the right people? So sometimes not adding anybody may be the right thing for a board to do, but adding the wrong people is never the right thing for a board to do. And you will see that these 2 steps are articulated. One is cultivation, which is what are we doing to thoughtfully recruit someone to learn about our organization and potentially be invited to our board, right? Cutting both ways, both for you and the individual. And then there's recruit. And those are 2 different steps. And we often confuse those steps. We will name someone and recruit them. We need to name them. We need to cultivate and decide, do they want to be brought to our board as a potential member? And I share recruitment step in the following way, because I still think there's a bit of a cultivation component to recruitment. And here's what that might sound like. I might say, well, Whitney, over time, you've become, more acquainted with Outreach Muncie, and you've seen our programs, you've seen the value of your contribution, right? You've met those whose lives we've impacted. 6 weeks from now, we're having elections to replace some board members whose terms have expired, and we'd like to consider you to fill one of those terms. Now, if you think about what I said, it is not insignificant. So let me point out the things that are super important about what I said. One is that it's a 6-week time frame. I said to Whitney, this isn't, I'll call you tomorrow and let you know you're elected. This is 6 weeks from now, we're having elections. The other thing is, I shared with her that she's filling the seats of some board members whose terms have expired, which says to Whitney, this is not a lifetime decision. We have a limit. We move people on and off our board. We open new networks. We get to new people. Okay. Very enticing for board members to know, hey, I'm not, deciding what the next 15 years of my life looks like as far as volunteering. And, what we do know is that some groups say to fill one term. We have 2 terms. We like to ask you to consider a first term, which says to her there may not be a second term, which is not a bad thing. So, and then Whitney has the opportunity to decide, what is my response to that? Might she give it that minute? Sure. Might she want to take a few days? Absolutely. And I'll add that depending on what the response is, there are replies to those responses. So if Whitney says no, I might explore what no means. Certainly accept no, but no might mean I don't know the role. No might mean I got a different job and I'm moving, but there's yet another way to engage me on a committee. So find out really what a no means. And in my world, a yes or a maybe should be followed up very closely with making sure the board member understands the expectation, or potential board member, excuse me. So make sure they know what the expectation of service is. If your board does not have a board member expectation, or a board member role determined for the board, that's a very important element you could be missing. So don't invite people unless you know what the role is going to be. And you can see in here, I don't want any board to soft pedal what the role of the board is. So if you are required to give, you're required to give. If you're required to attend meetings, you're required to attend meetings. There isn't a, but you're special and therefore kind of situation. A lot of boards I work with come to points of turmoil that are based on a set of rules they're not following. You either do or don't do something. Okay. I'm not saying everyone performs at the same level. I'm not saying everyone brings the same skill. I'm not saying everyone gives the same amount or raises the same amount of money or serves on the same number of committees. I'm saying that there's a baseline expectation that everybody meets. And once you stop allowing that to happen, it becomes the Wild West. Then how do you create accountability? Be transparent, be clear about the role. If giving is relevant, then you want to emphasize that, and you want to distinguish, what does that mean? Is it an individual gift? Is it a corporate gift? Is there a do you need to distinguish between the two of those? Make it very clear what that means. And the other thing is, and we'll get to this, is I'm big on evaluation. And so if there's an evaluation process on your board, I think Whitney wants to know there's an evaluation process. Let her know what the rules to participate are. Then she can make a best informed decision about whether or not she wants to be considered. Okay. So from recruitment, and remember, if you're, and reemphasize, if you don't have a job description, it's just not fair to ask people to serve when they just don't know what the role is. Okay, so that may be an element for many of us that either we don't have, we need to update, we need to revisit, think about what the role of a board is. The number of times that a CEO has approached me frustrated with the level of board participation, and the number of times that a board chair might bring that to me, I can't even begin to count. And it all starts at the recruitment phase. It does not start after someone joins the board. You can't tell me what the job is after you brought me on board. Step number 4 is orient, and I hope all of you have some type of board orientation process. So all new board members should have the opportunity to meet and sit down with board members and supported by the staff, not the staff running the orientation and board members participating. And where we go through, and we all have the world famous handbook, right? It has these things in it, right? And we're going over these items at a very high level. We're not reading through all of them. How do we make sure that everybody that's new to the board is acquainted with how we operate and function, what our committee structure is, reinforce the culture that they've already seen and been exposed to, right? What is governance versus the role of the board and staff? Where is that separation? We govern, we don't manage. All of those things through an orientation process. And I have to say, I'm kind of old school. and I am the chair of a board. So I want to share this with you both as a consultant, as someone who does the work as a volunteer. I'm old school. I think there's real value in a book. I think there's real value in the 3-hole punch with the binder. However, the board I serve on also does has some of the has a software product, right? The ones that offer the board portal products where everything is online and interactions can take place and notices can happen and records can be kept and files can be uploaded. I'm completely in favor of that. What I think that does say to us then is, how do we train our board members and how to use that? Because where it falls short is, yes, we have XYZ product. We made you log in, go. Like, you also have to orient them on that product and how it works and give them a sense of how your organization gets value out of it. The fifth part of the cycle is engaging board members. So we do this in two ways. One is we make sure that we are directing board members to the committee or the kind of board work that fits their skill set. Remember, we've recruited people based on their skill set. And so let's plug them in where they fit relative to that skill set. And the other, and many boards do this, and I think it's a really cool idea, is have a buddy or a mentor, somebody that can sit with, guide new board members and other board members, right? So who on your board would be really good at being a mentor or a buddy to speed up that sort of learning curve, create that sense of affiliation, and get people moving quickly into the roles that they play? So again, remember, this was about bringing people to the organization, and then it's about growing them. Well, one of the ways we grow them is we prepare them. The other way we grow them is we engage them, right? We continue to support them. And then the sixth step is educate. And this, to me, is probably one of the most overlooked components of the board building cycle. Now, if I had asked, what do we educate board members about? We would get a myriad of mission, number of people we serve, the size of our county, what our programs are, what our budget is, right? And what I'm talking about are things like this. Okay. Now, specific impacts of work is easy, but are you talking about issues and news in your sector, maybe your specific line of work? Are you training board members how to ask for money? Are you making them comfortable talking about wills and bequests? Are you educating donors about the required minimum distribution and donor advised funds? Are you talking about how legislation might impact your organization? How about helping board members understand there are similar organizations that we may or may not compete with? How are we unique? How are we different? And at the bottom, most importantly, is to help board members teach them and help them share powerful stories of our organization. Nothing amplifies what people know about us in our community the way having all of your board members equipped and ready and eagerly sharing stories about your organization. Right now, many of our boards know about our work, but they couldn't articulate it in a way that's highly meaningful or, provides that hook, creates interest. That's time well spent. And we suggest that education, for the most part, might be 10 minutes at the start of every board meeting. Invite someone in the financial services industry to talk about, a gift of an RMD or how a DAF works. They'd happily do it for 10 minutes. I mean, and I emphasize before the meeting starts, not at the end of the meeting. Okay. Timing is important on these things. 10 minutes per meeting. If you're going to spend time talking about storytelling, you might want to spend a little more time on that. Maybe that's a retreat or a different setting. You need to educate board members. The board needs to support and grow itself. Educate, make board members good at what you're asking them of them. Give them the tools, equip them. Okay. 7 is rotate. So this is not a legal issue. There's not a legal demand that says board members should have term limits. But we believe, my colleagues and I very strongly, that having a set of term limits where there's a maximum amount of time any individual board member can serve is very important. At the end of that 6 total years they have to roll off, or 9, or whatever that total number of years is. And it does a couple things. One, it creates new connectivity, right? One of the complaints that, or frustrations that is shared with me, is the lack of community visibility and connectivity. Well, if you never change board members, how do you get new connectivity and new visibility? The other is we get stuck. We get stuck in how we think and do things when the same people are governing our organization over a long period of time. And the other issue becomes, and I can assure you of this, that when I interact with a client where there's board turmoil, while there are differences, if I gave you 5, I'd point out differences amongst them, but all 5 of them, in my experience, would not have had term limits. And keeping people for a long period of time is a challenge, and it creates challenges. So be creative. If you have them, follow them. If, again, earlier, as I said, if you have rules and you're not following them, you don't have rules. And don't make exceptions for people. Think about ways to engage really meaningful people. Do you create a senior governance council, or senior governance council, a senior leadership team, some adjunct body that has no governing authority, but still maintains a close contact and relationship with the organization? So it's not an either or, it's an and both. And I think sometimes we get afraid to think about this because, frankly, we've not done any board building, so we don't have anyone to replace them. So let's just do nothing. And that's kicking the can down the road, and you're eventually going to run into issues. Step 8 is evaluate. So are we evaluating board member performance? So I'm, very, very particular and encourage groups all the time to evaluate board member performance. So what do I mean? Well, as an example, at the beginning of the last board meeting of the year, there ought to be some type of board member self-evaluation. Okay. How am I, Dave Sternberg, doing as a board member, right? What am I doing against the, when compared to what is expected of me? So these questions, when you create something like this, ought to be geared towards what the expectations are. So don't add things that are not expected of me. And make the answers pretty clear. I did or I didn't do it, or I'm not sure. The Likert scale, I mean, if everyone averaged 3, I'm not sure, out of 5, I'm not sure what that means. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't have any idea. So this ought to be an inflection moment, a reflection of how did I perform, okay? Now, and then it's collected. So we fill it out. The meeting doesn't start until we've done it, and we're collecting it. Now, a lot of boards, and I encourage this too, is to track board progress as a whole throughout the year. And this kind of scorecard, if you will, provides that opportunity. And you will see on the far left, you can do this, one of 2 ways. You can do it with people's names, Bill Jones, Steve Smith, or you can do it anonymously, right? You just, our culture it wouldn't work well with our culture to put people's names. But here are the things we're measuring, the concrete sorts of things we're measuring that are expectations. And share this every board meeting. How are people doing? Now, this has a couple of really good benefits. One is everyone knows who they are, regardless of how you do this, whether you do it in person, whether you share names or you do it anonymously. I mean, if you're board member A or B, you just know, what the data is associated with you. Now, the reality, the other side of this that's beneficial, is the board gets an opportunity to understand how is the board doing and where do I fit relative to how the board's doing. So it kind of has a calling out effect, which I think can be super beneficial, but it also puts in perspective, how are we functioning as a body? And a lot of organizations will, do some math at the bottom and put totals and averages. And I think that can be super helpful. But here, what we're doing is we're saying, here's what's expected of us as a body. Here we are. And here's what's expected of you later in the year. You get to rate how you're doing and what your expectation of, how you're doing against the expectations. Okay. Now, before we're done, I promise I will go over who is in charge of doing this, because that's a common question and it's an excellent question. But I want to get through the cycle, and then we'll get into some of the how do you implement details. So evaluation is super important. And then finally is the ninth part of the cycle is celebrate. Our boards are doing good work. There are many board members who are exemplary, who are doing good work. I'm going to go so far as to say, if you're on the call today and you're a board member, you're doing that kind of work. Okay, this is an hour that you're devoting to learn, to grow, to bring something back to the organization. That's an A+ kind of action or activity. So celebrate those things, and everything that can be celebrated, celebrate it. And I start board meetings as a board chair myself by calling out before we get started and complimenting and thanking board members for the activities they've done between board meetings that are meaningful. I have a colleague who said years ago, board members are made between board meetings, not at them. And so what are we doing between those board meetings? Thanks for hosting the event. Thanks for writing thank you notes. Thanks for making thank you calls. Thanks for going with staff on a, thanks for representing us at the XYZ event. These are the things. Role model that behavior and thank people publicly. Okay. So hopefully you get a sense of how the 9 parts of the cycle and the 3 phases all fit together. We're recruiting, we're preparing and building, we're creating a sense of support and accountability, and we're rotating folks off in a way that's going to beget itself over time. And hopefully you begin to see a picture and say, if our organization implemented this, yes, the board would look different and we'd have different people. It has never been a case in my 30+ years of doing nonprofit work where I met someone who had ill intent. Our volunteers don't have ill intent. This isn't a personal matter. This isn't they're trying to make the organization worse. We just assume they know things they don't know, and we assume that our processes are good, and sometimes they're not. And I've learned the hard way not to assume everyone knows. I don't know everything. And I go into situations with a mind of learning and seeing how we can do things differently and what that might look like. Whitney, I'm going to pause and lean on you to see if there's questions that need to be answered. Is there anything in the chat that I need to look at, Whitney?
Lisa they asked if people can change their bylaws to incorporate term limits.
Yes, you absolutely can make those changes to your bylaws. Near the end of your bylaws, there's going to be the rules by which that dictate how do you change your bylaws. So you just need to follow the rules articulated in your bylaws. And I've seen all kind, like it'll say something along the lines. It's under the section called amendments, probably says the guy who never went to law school. And it will tell you how to amend them in those bylaws, and then you follow them. I think that's a good technical question. I think the first half of that question is politically and culturally, what do we need to do to bring a bylaw change that our organization would accept? And that can be the greater challenge, particularly when you have board members who've been there a very long time. And so that is a different question you didn't ask, but sometimes that gets to be a question. So
Thank
question.
you.
Yeah.
Also, can you share point number 7 again?
I can. I believe I can. Yes, rotate. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
The other thing, when you read number 7, where it says don't automatically reelect people. If Whitney has served a term, but she's not a good board member and probably can't, improve her performance, or there's something else going on in her life, then don't reelect her. Don't even ask if she wants to be reelected, because her answer will be yes, and you'll be stuck. So we'll talk about the hows here in a minute. So yeah. Okay. Great questions. Whitney?
What about a super board member who contributes over and beyond the expectations of the board? Do you prefer that these should also be rotated also?
I absolutely do. I don't think there's an exception to this. Now, that's where I get into, I would invite that board member or board members of that caliber to help us explore adjunct bodies that they can participate in. Do I invite them to help us create a senior leadership council that they might start off as the chair and invite really stellar board members who are rolling off to be part of it? Those folks, what I find with 2 things. One is we generally are fearful of asking them because we don't want to know what the answer is. And 99 times out of 100, the answer is, yeah, absolutely. How do I make this a better place? If making space for someone else is the way to do that, then I want to do that. So invite this as a conversation about how can we grow the board by rolling people off and still inviting those that are important to us.
And then I think finally, people are asking, can you share who the responsibilities of building this board should fall onto? Is it the executive director, the board chair,
Right.
a team?
Right. Yeah. So Whitney, that's the next best question because that's where we're going. So
Perfect.
the question is, who does this work, right? And so what we encourage is for boards to have a governance committee. And we've heard this referred to in numerous ways. Big, sort of complicated boards, it's the committee on directorship or trusteeship, whatever. But the governance committee, and what the governance committee does, and this is a board committee, and I'm underscoring board because the question is this the executive director's work? Is this the board's work? It's the board's work. I do not believe that you should exempt or cut out or not encourage the input of our CEO, but this is board work. Okay. So look at what the responsibilities are. Making sure that we're educating the board, assessing our governance needs, right? Which looks at the bylaws, which looks at leadership, which looks at the matrix, which looks at who's being recruited. They oversee an orientation happens, and those self-assessment components also go to this committee. Okay, so the self-assessment for sure, the whole board assessment and all, what I've seen most commonly is they're the ones, that are sharing that then at a board meeting. And maybe they need the staff's help tracking the data, but the board wants to present that data. I always say the board cares and feeds for its young. The board is in charge. The CEO or executive director is not. Okay. I say the board governs the life of the organization. The CEO, executive director manages the daily affairs of the organization. These are two distinct roles. Sure, there's some partnership somewhere in the middle, but the board needs to make sure the board is what the board needs to be. And again, do I involve my CEO, take recommendations, get feedback? Sure, I do. But it isn't up to them. So from a process orientation standpoint, it is something like a governance committee, if not a governance committee. And I will say this, what tends to happen, and I always share this because it gets to be a concern, is the governance committee is not the executive committee. Those are two separate committees. So, yeah, okay, Dave, our board's 12. Well, then you have too few board members to sort of make this a clear distinguishing factor. But if you're bigger, this is not the executive committee. And one of the reasons I say that is when we make it the executive committee, the message we're sending to our board is, unless you're an officer, you really don't have any influence or power. And I think that's potentially a bad message. So if you're large enough and have that capacity to have a separate group board members, I strongly encourage that. Okay. Or if in the short term it's the executive committee and the plan is to shift that, great. But don't let it be the executive committee for the long haul. Okay. Now, a couple of unwritten rules relative to, I call them unwritten. I think they're written. I think they're ironclad stone, should never be violated. But how do we organize these people? Well, the first one is we think about putting them on a committee. And I mentioned that. Simply don't let your committee be a board committee if it isn't doing board work. Board committees do board work. They do not do staff work. Okay. So think about those program committees. Is that board or staff work, right? So think about if you look at the responsibility far left, maybe that better words committee. Governance is board work. Check. It should be a committee because it's ongoing. Program. Maybe it's not really board work and all we're doing is inviting board members into the daily operations or getting into micromanagement. I would have no issue with the CEO, as you see the check mark there, creating his or her own committee, but it's not going to involve the board. Is finance board work? yet. 100% it's board work. 100% it's ongoing committee work. Check, check. Strategic planning. Well, we don't do it that often. We do it every few years. Now it's board work. Board sets the direction without question. Maybe that's the time, rather than to have a committee that meets about strategic planning, which we don't do that routinely. Maybe it's better that that's a task force that we assemble of board members to move us through the strategic planning process. Finally, development, and these are a list of just a few committees. I think development, aka fundraising, is board work. I 100% think that is board work. And I think you could have a committee, but as soon as that committee is its own entity and does all the fundraising and no one joins it who doesn't want to do fundraising, I think it's not working well for you. It has to be the committee that keeps everyone on the board involved in fundraising. So just a flavor of those considerations. As soon as we view committees as staff work, we are going to get an additional layer of people who have opinions about how to manage and what should happen that we probably at the staff level, the CEO level for sure, probably don't need. And so now what we've created is tension where it doesn't even belong. So think about strategically, what should our committee structure look like, and make sure it's board work. The other thing to mention is, even with the greatest board committee structure, don't run poor meetings. Don't run meetings that are show and tell, that are review of the minutes and we go through reports ad nauseum that people can pre-read in advance, and we go home and we don't take any action. We don't have any substantive discussion. There's no intellectual exchange on things that are the most important to our organization, and don't meet too many times. Now, I don't know the right amount of times for any singular board. I don't. What I do know is that 12 is probably a lot unless you happen to be in a point of crisis, right? Monthly is a lot. And I say that because monthly, what happens in 30 days is not a whole lot. And so you do get into the rogue sort of reporting and updating, and maybe you don't need to be together for that purpose. I had a client years ago who was meeting monthly, and they were having a crisis. They were having a financial crisis, legitimate, and they were meeting every month, and it made sense. Like, yes, you should meet every month. When they weathered that storm, okay, they were still meeting monthly, and the board chair said to the board, "Do you think we should meet every month?" And there was some looking around, and one of the board members said, "Well, I think I really like getting together every month." And everyone said, "Yeah, we like getting together." And he said, "All right, we'll continue to meet every month." And I interrupted him. Forgive me. I said, "Well, what I heard was you like getting together. What I didn't hear was we should have a meeting every month." So what they thought about was, well, okay, all right, what if we met every other month? And the months where we didn't have a meeting, there could be something else put in that place. Is that the time for committee work? Is that the time for an educational component? So yes, let's get together, but let's do it in a way that's meaningful for us as a board. Not they're here, we got to have this real formal agenda and we got to do some work and everyone has to feel. I'm just speaking for myself. I don't want to manage an organization. I don't. I want to govern the organization. I want to grow its visibility. I want to attract resources, right? That's what we want to be doing, right? Yes, oversight. Yes, understanding the budget. Yes, all of those components. I understand those duties. But what else are we supposed to be doing to grow this entity? And I've said to board members, your job is to grow the organization. It isn't to keep it the same, because keeping it the same is actually going backwards. So how do we grow the entity? And I think I sort of indirectly made this point a few times, which is when we're not focusing on board work, it's just not as meaningful. And we're probably not going to help edge, push, think about how do we move the organization forward. So we want to do committee work and board meetings in a way that helps us focus on the highest and most important issues of our organization, right? Whatever they are. Is it board recruitment? Is it funding? Are there concerns about community relationships? Do we want to consider a campaign to build a new building? Right? These are the big picture things. They're not the things that are happening on a daily basis that board members need to be getting involved in. Again, You have a CEO where you have staff that's running the organization on a day-to-day basis. Handful of common questions, Whitney, and then we'll get down to any other questions that might be in the chat. One is, how many board members should our board have? And the answer is, I have no idea. Let me share an important stat with you. Well, it's not important, it's just a stat. But the average size nonprofit board in the US is 16. All right. Now, that is helpful, except that the question I would ask is, if all the seats on your board were full, what would be the average size? Is it 20? Is it 18? I have no idea. But here's the questions I would ask you to present to the organization to answer this question for yourself. One is, what is board work? So, and this ties back to the committee structure. So if board work is advocating, being a public, talking about the organization in public, being involved in development work, right? If those things are part of board work, then the argument I make is, well, 20 is better than 7. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean 20 is the right number, but more is better than less. The other question I would ask myself is, what is your service area? So many of our organizations serve a county or multiple counties, right? And so I say to myself, if we serve a big geographic area, we probably want representation from multiple portions of that geographical area, right? I serve on a board that's national. So we have to think about West Coast, right? Midwest, Northeast, right? The plains. What about Texas? How about South? Where do we need to have board members represented? That doesn't mean, oh, we found a name there in Florida, good. We are still using the board building cycle, but we are thinking about, where do we need to have exposure and the ability to become visible? So what's your service territory? And the final question, believe it or not, is, how many staff members do you have? And I say this because a good board is supported by the staff, right? We are volunteers at the end of the day. And there are things that will be asked of us by the board that we may need help with. We may need someone to track the data so we can report to the board how they're functioning. We may need the staff to do a little research to come back and help our committee, right? There are all kinds of things we might need the staff to help us. And most importantly is, a really, really smart CEO, and there's many on this call, they know what they need to do to support the board. And it isn't to demand, and it isn't to force, it is to support. It is to gently guide and push. It is to supply information. It is to create the environment for the board to have some of those self-realization moments where, hey, we have a question about this. And those are the really sharp CEOs in our state. And there's lots of them. So, but the more staff you have, the bigger a board can be, right? So if you're a staff of 2, 20 board members is pretty unwieldy. I'll grant you that. So think about, how are we capable of supporting our board? I talked about board meetings. Advisory boards, I referred to a couple of, on the rotate issue in the board building cycle, I referred to a couple of strategies relative to how to engage board members, senior leadership team, senior advisory council. We've seen emeritus. I just I'm biased against the word advisory, and I'm just biased against that particular word because I still rarely meet an executive who needs advice. And I don't think we're inviting people in just for advice. I think we're inviting them in for a whole host of reasons. But when we use that word, it suggests, well, we just want to be here and get your feedback. Well, if that's all you wanted, here it is. I've got plenty of it. And if you stop listening to it, I might not be engaged at all. So I want to tread lightly with the use of the word advisory. And so we have time for questions. Let me finally say, you should not copy what other boards do. Just because a board does X or Y does not mean X or Y is right for you. So time and time again, when I ask you, well, who do you think are the strong boards in your community? If you made a list of 2 or 3 organizations, I'd set aside time, go meet with the board chair or the CEO and find out how do they operate? What's their culture? What are the things they think make them strong? Where are their challenges? Because what works for one may not work for another. What I do know is if there were 100 organizations on this call today, there are 100 board cultures. And that has a huge impact on anything we attempt to do within our organization. We simply can't overlook that. So don't just copy folks. Don't say this is the right number because it's the right number for them, or this is how we should meet because that's how they meet. You need to figure out what works for you and do that, but ask the important questions. Whitney, I'm going to pause. What questions do we have in the new questions that we have in the chat?
Absolutely. A couple people are wanting information on suggestions for recruiting young professionals.
Yeah, so here's the things that I hear in the sector that are super helpful. One is to let them know that your organization has term limits. And I say that, I'm not even making a joke, and I tend to kind of joke around. Young people, younger, and younger, I'm going to say millennials and younger, maybe some of the younger boomers, or Xers. I'm the oldest Xer. So just, if you're trying to figure that out. It's term limits, letting them know that this is not something they have to commit to for the rest of their life. And the other thing is, one of the greatest ways to get younger board members, which is why I like the cultivation piece, is they like to really be involved. How do you give them a flavor of the work of the organization? I think that speaks volumes to being sensitive to how younger board members want to be involved. Like, is this right for me? Because hands-on is important. Now, teaching them governance is going to be important because that's a different thing, but this is how they get engaged.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any ideas on how to move a board member over to the ex officio board? They don't have the time to fulfill their board membership, but don't seem to have interest in a lesser responsibility role.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that a couple of different ways since I don't know your situation. But one is familiarize yourself with your bylaws and determine how does a board member get removed. You need to understand that. Okay. And almost everyone's bylaws suggest that a board member can be removed by the board. Okay. And then most of them don't even give a reason. It's rarely done. That doesn't make it right or wrong. The other thing is, do you have term limits? And if you don't have term limits, then you may have to take the adjunct step of creating them, um, and having that person serve another term. Or you can create term limits, right? And just not elect them to another term. Finally, one of the simplest things to do is to have board leadership. Is that the board chair or your governance committee chair? Sit down with them one-on-one and find out what the issues are and let them know that they are not performing at the same level as other board members, and for their for them, they need to know that. But if you don't have a mechanism that, again, here's a perfect example of term limits. Well, you can't get rid of me. Well, we can. So think about what the tactics are that are available to you, and I would imagine if you have term limits, you're not following, so now's the time to follow them. If you don't, is it time for them? I mean, these are the technical background questions I'd ask.
Awesome. What is your advice about an advisory board versus an executive board?
So advisory boards generally don't have governing authority. They don't have vote. They're not allowed to, enact policy or make decisions. An executive board, that is commonly how folks refer to their executive committee. So big boards, they'll say, well, the executive board does that. And we'll say, well, is that different than the governing board? Well, no. So they've inserted the word board where it probably didn't belong. It's the executive committee. It's not the executive board. Now, could your bylaws state that there are those two classes? Possibly, but it would also then detail what the roles of those two bodies would be as well. So I go back, I don't know what I don't know, but I go back and I ask, is there actually a separate board or is it just your executive committee?
Then I have one final question.
Sure.
Um, is a working board acceptable to do staff work?
Okay, so I call every board a working board. The question is, what is the work? Okay, so I just want to clear, I say that all the time. Every board does work. If you are a grassroots organization and don't have any staff, yes, that's how work is going to get done. And if you're in that situation, I always encourage a set aside time to have a strategic discussion about how do we move to the next level where we can have a staff person and start to create that separation. And if the answer is we just don't have enough money, then the question is how do we get the money? So don't stop at, well, when the money comes, think about that next question. The other thing is, if you have staff and the board views itself as part of the delivery of service, you have a board culture issue. They are not familiar with what does governing an organization mean. And that could be a result of, the organization is only 15 years old and we're evolving, or that could be a history and habit issue. It's just what the board's always done. So my question is, does education help them? There's a great book. It's called The 10 Responsibilities. My guess is somewhere in the resources of IYI they have this, but it's from Board Source also, and it outlines the 10 roles of a nonprofit board. And it in nowhere does it say deliver program. In fact, it explicitly says not to deliver program. That doesn't mean I, as a board member, couldn't volunteer on weekends to work, but my role as a board is different, right? We need volunteers, we need staff, and we need board. And while they're all equal, they're not the same job. So they need to separate those jobs out a little bit.
And then our final question, is
Mhm.
Board Source a free resource?
Board Source is not. Whitney, I would endeavor to wonder if IYI is an institutional member and if that extends to the groups in IYI. I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not turning this back on Whitney, but it is not. And so you'd have to pay, and then you can buy all the resources without being a member. They just charge a little bit more for them. So, and sometimes that may be the route to go. So, Whitney.
Thank you so much, Dave. I'm just gonna share a little bit of information. All right. So again, thank you all for attending this webinar. All of IYI's upcoming events can be found at www.iyii.org/events. Excuse me. Please do not forget to register for our November 11th webinar, How to Build a Compelling Case for Our Organization, Telling Your Story, Stating Your Case with Tamara Winfrey Harris. Sorry, I got a tickle there. As we conclude, I sincerely thank you for being with us today. You can receive the latest updates and opportunities by signing up for our newsletter at www.iyii.org/newsletter. Thank you again. We appreciate your impact, voice, and choice to learn and partner with IYI today. Later today, you will receive an email that includes a copy of the presentation and a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about today's presentation. Upon completion, you will be redirected to your certificate for completion. If you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk email. It may have been directed there. That concludes our presentation, and on behalf of Indiana's youth, thank you again for showing up today and every day for Indiana youth.